Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special shout out of thanks to 4 new members of our Patreon: Anthony, Diego, Daniel, and Heather. Thank you all so much for supporting this podcast. It's only through your help and the help of other patrons that we can keep making new episodes week after week and keep them ad-free for everyone, and it's very much appreciated. If you are interested in learning more about the perks available to Patreon subscribers, including exclusive episodes heard nowhere else, you'll find a link to Patreon in the show description. You'll also find a link to buymeacoffee.com, where you can support us with a one-time tip, no subscription required. I hope you'll take a moment to check them out. And thank you to everyone who's done so far. It really is appreciated. Now, let's read and relax. Find a comfortable spot. Adjust your volume. Take a nice, deep breath in. Let it out slowly. And off we go. Tonight we're relaxing with a classic from the Father of American Beekeeping, The Hive and the Honeybee, a Beekeeper's Manual, by Reverend L.L. Langstroth. Published in 1853 by Hopkins, Bridgman and Company, Northampton, Massachusetts, and entered according to Act of Congress in the year 1853 by L.L. Langstroth in the Clerk's Office of the District Court of Massachusetts. Let's begin. Preface. This treatise on the hive and the honeybee is respectfully submitted by the author to the candid consideration of those who are interested in the culture of the most useful as well as wonderful insect in all the range of animated nature. The information which it contains will be found to be greatly in advance of anything which has yet been presented to the English reader, and as far as facilities for practical management are concerned, it is believed to be a very material advance over anything which has hitherto been communicated to the apiarian public. Debarred by the state of his health from the more appropriate duties of his office, and compelled to seek an employment which would call him as much as possible into the open air, the author indulges the hope that the result of his studies and observations in an important branch of natural history will be found of service to the community as well as to himself. The satisfaction which he has taken in his researches has been such that he has felt exceedingly desirous of interesting others in a pursuit which, without any reference to its pecuniary profits, is capable of exciting the delight and enthusiasm of all intelligent observers. The Creator may be seen in all the works of his hands, but in few more directly than in the wise economy of the honeybee. What well-appointed commonwealths, where each adds to the stock of happiness for all, wisdom's own forums, whose professors teach eloquent lessons in their vaulted hall, galleries of art, and schools of industry, stores of rich fragrance, orchestras of song, what marvelous seats of hidden alchemy! How oft, when wandering far and erring long, man might learn truth and virtue from the bee. the attention of clergymen is particularly solicited to the study of this branch of natural history. An intimate acquaintance with the wonders of the beehive, while it would benefit them in various ways, might lead them to draw their illustrations more from natural objects and the world around them, and in this way to adapt them better to the comprehension and sympathies of their hearers. It was, we know, the constant practice of our Lord and Master to illustrate his teachings from the birds of the air, the lilies of the field, and the common walks of life and pursuits of men. Common sense, experience, and religion alike dictate that we should follow his example. Reverend L. L. Langstroth, Greenfield, Massachusetts, May 25, 1853. Advertisement. L. L. Langstroth's Movable Comb Hive, patented October 5, 1862. Each comb in this hive is attached to a separate movable frame, and in less than 5 minutes they may all be taken out without cutting or injuring them, or at all enraging the bees. Weak stocks may be quickly strengthened by helping them to honey and maturing brood from stronger ones. Queenless colonies may be rescued from certain ruin by supplying them with the means of obtaining another queen, and the ravages of the moth effectually prevented, as at any time the hive may be readily examined, and all the worms, etc., removed from their combs. New colonies may be formed in less time than is usually required to hive a natural swarm, or the hive may be used as a non-swarmer, or managed on the common swarming plan. The surplus honey may be taken from the interior of the hive on the frames, or in upper boxes or glasses, in the most convenient, beautiful, and saleable forms. Colonies may be safely transferred from any other hive to this, at any season of the year from April to October, as the brood, combs, honey, and all the contents of the hive are transferred with them and securely fastened in the frames. That the combs can always be removed from this hive with ease and safety, and that the new system, by giving the perfect control over all the combs, effects a complete revolution in practical beekeeping, the subscriber prefers to prove rather than assert. Practical apiarians and all who wish to purchase rights and hives are invited to visit his apiary, where combs, honey, and bees will be taken from the hives, colonies which may be brought to him for that purpose transferred from any old hive, queens, and the whole process of rearing them constantly exhibited, new colonies formed, and all processes connected with the practical management of an apiary fully illustrated and explained. Those who have any considerable number of bees will find it in their interest to have at least one movable comb hive in their apiary, from which they may, in a few minutes, supply any colony which has lost its queen with the means of rearing another. The hive and right will be furnished on the following terms. For an individual or farm right, $5. This will entitle the purchaser to use and construct for his own use on his own premises as many hives as he chooses. The hives are manufactured by machinery and can probably be delivered, freight included, at any railroad station in New England or New York, cheaper than they could be made in small quantities on the spot. On receipt of a hive, the purchaser can decide for himself whether he prefers to make them or to order them of the patentee. For $1, postage paid, the book will be sent free by mail. On receipt of $10, a beautiful hive showing all the combs, with glass on 4 sides, will be sent with right, freight paid to any railroad station in New England or New York. A right and hive which will accommodate 2 colonies, with glass on each side, for $12. For $7, a right and a well-made hive that anyone can construct who can handle the simplest tools. In all cases where the hives are sent out of New England or New York, as the freight will not be prepaid, $1 will be deducted from the above prices. Address: L.L. Langstroth, Greenfield, Massachusetts. The Hive and the Honey Bee, a Beekeeper's Manual. Introduction, Chapter 1. The present condition of practical beekeeping in this country is known to be deplorably low. From the great mass of agriculturists and others favorably situated for obtaining honey, it receives not the slightest attention. Notwithstanding the large number of patent hives which have been introduced, the ravages of the bee moth have increased, and success is becoming more and more precarious. Multitudes have abandoned the pursuit in disgust, while many of the most experienced are fast settling down into the conviction that all the so-called improved hives are delusions, and that they must return to the simple box or hollow log and take up their bees with sulfur in the old-fashioned way. In the present state of public opinion, it requires no little courage to venture upon the introduction of a new hive and system of management. But I feel confident that a new era in beekeeping has arrived, and invite the attention of all interested to the reasons for this belief. A perusal of this manual will, I trust, convince them that there is a better way than any with which they have been yet acquainted. They will here find many hitherto mysterious points in the physiology of the honeybee clearly explained, and much valuable information never before communicated to the public. It is now nearly 15 years since I first turned my attention to the cultivation of bees. The state of my health having compelled me to live more and more in the open air, I have devoted a large portion of my time of late years to a careful investigation of their habits, and to a series of minute and thorough experiments in the construction of hives and the best methods of managing them, so as to secure the largest practical results. Very early in my apiarian studies, I procured an imported copy of the work of the celebrated Huber, and constructed a hive on his plan, which furnished me with favorable opportunities of verifying some of his most valuable discovery, and I soon found that the prejudices existing against him were entirely unfounded. Believing that his discoveries laid the foundation for a more extended and profitable system of beekeeping, I began to experiment with hives of various construction. The result of all these investigations fell far short of my expectations. I became, however, most thoroughly convinced that no hives were fit to be used unless they furnished uncommon protection against extremes of heat, and more especially of cold. I accordingly discarded all thin hives made of inch stuff, and constructed my hives of doubled materials, enclosing a dead air space all around. These hives, although more expensive in the first cost, proved to be much cheaper in the end than those I had previously used. The bees wintered remarkably well in them, and swarmed early and with unusual regularity. My next step in advance was, while I secured my surplus honey in the most convenient, beautiful, and saleable forms, to facilitate the entrance of the bees into the honey receptacles, as to secure the largest fruits from their labors. Although I felt confident that my hive possessed some valuable peculiarities, I still found myself unable to remedy many of the casualties to which beekeeping is liable. I now perceived that no hive could be made to answer my expectations, unless it gave me the complete control of the combs, so that I might remove any or all of them at pleasure. The use of the Huber hive had convinced me that with proper precautions, the combs might be removed without enraging the bees, and that these insects were capable of being domesticated or tamed to a most surprising degree. A knowledge of these facts was absolutely necessary to the further progress of my invention, for without it, I should have regarded a hive designed to allow of the removal of the combs as too dangerous in use to be of any practical value. At first, I used movable slats or bars placed on rabbets in the front and back of the hive. The bees were induced to build their combs upon these bars, and in carrying them down, to fasten them to the sides of the hive. By severing the attachments to the sides, I was able at any time to remove the combs suspended from the bars. There was nothing new in the use of movable bars, the invention being probably at least 100 years old, and I had myself used such hives on Bevan's plan very early in the commencement of my experiments. The chief peculiarity in my hives, as now constructed, was the facility with which these bars could be removed without enraging the bees, and their combination with my new mode of obtaining the surplus honey. With hives of this construction, I commenced experimenting on a larger scale than ever, and soon arrived at results which proved to be of the very first importance. I found myself able, if I wished it, to dispense entirely with natural swarming, and yet to multiply colonies with much greater rapidity and certainty than by the common methods. I could in a short time strengthen my feeble colonies, and furnish those which had lost their queen with the means of obtaining another. If I suspected that anything was the matter with a hive, I could ascertain its true condition by making a thorough examination of every part, and if the worms had gained a lodgment, I could quickly dispossess them. In short, I could perform all the operations which will be explained in this treatise, and I now believed that beekeeping could be made highly profitable, and as much a matter of certainty as any other branch of rural economy. I perceived, however, that one thing was yet wanting. The cutting of the combs from their attachments to the sides of the hive in order to remove them was attended with much loss of time to myself and to the bees, and in order to facilitate this operation, the construction of my hive was necessarily complicated. This led me to invent a method by which the combs were attached to movable frames and suspended in the hives so as to touch neither the top, bottom, nor sides. By this device I was able to remove the combs at pleasure, and if desired I could speedily transfer them, bees and all, without any cutting to another hive. I have experimented largely with hives of this construction, and find that they answer most admirably all the ends proposed in their invention. While experimenting in the summer of 1851 with some observing hives of a peculiar construction, I discovered that bees could be made to work in glass hives exposed to the full light of day. The notice in a Philadelphia newspaper of this discovery procured me the pleasure of an acquaintance with Reverend Dr. Berg, pastor of a Dutch Reformed church in that city. From him I first learned that a Prussian clergyman of the name of Tsertson had attracted the attention of crowned heads by his important discoveries in the management of bees. Before he communicated the particulars of these discoveries, I explained to Dr. Berg my system of management and showed him my hive. He expressed the greatest astonishment at the wonderful similarity in our methods of management, both of us having carried on our investigations without the slightest knowledge of each other's labors. Our hives he found to differ in some very important respects. In the Tsertson hive, the combs are not attached to movable frames, but to bars, so that they cannot, without cutting, be removed from the hive. In my hive, which is opened from the top, any comb may be taken out without at all disturbing the others, whereas in the Tsertson hive, which is opened from one of the ends, it is often necessary to cut and remove many combs in order to get access to a particular one. Thus, if the 10th comb from the end is to be removed, 9 combs must be first cut and taken out. All this consumes a large amount of time. The German hive does not furnish the surplus honey in a form which would be found most saleable in our markets, or which would admit of safe transportation in the comb. Notwithstanding these disadvantages, it has achieved a great triumph in Germany and given a new impulse to the cultivation of bees. The following letter from Samuel Wagner, Esquire, cashier of the bank in York, Pennsylvania, will show the results which have been obtained in Germany by the new system of management, and his estimate of the superior value of my hive to those in use there. York, PA, December 24, 1852. Dear Sir, the Tsertson theory and the system of bee management based thereon were originally promulgated hypothetically in the Bee Journal in 1845, and at once arrested my attention. Subsequently, when in 1848, at the insistence of the Prussian government, the Reverend Mr. Tsertson published his Theory and Practice of Bee Culture, I imported a copy which reached me in 1849, and which I translated prior to January 1850. Before the translation was completed, I received a visit from my friend, the Reverend Dr. Berg of Philadelphia, and in the course of conversation on beekeeping, mentioned to him the Zerzon theory and system as one which I regarded as new and very superior, though I had had no opportunity for testing it practically. In February following, when in Philadelphia, I left with him the translation in manuscript, up to which period I doubt whether any other person in this country had any knowledge of the Zerzon theory. Except to Dr. Berg, I had never mentioned it to anyone save in very general terms. In September 1851, Dr. Berg again visited York and stated to me your investigations, discoveries, and inventions. From the account Dr. Berg gave me, I felt assured that you had devised substantially the same system as that so successfully pursued by Mr. Zerzon. But how far your hive resembled his, I was unable to judge from description alone. I inferred, however, several points of difference. The coincidence as to system and the principles on which it was evidently founded struck me as exceedingly singular and interesting, because I felt confident that you had no more knowledge of Mr. Zerzon and his labors before Dr. Berg mentioned him and his book to you than Mr. Zerzon had of you. These circumstances made me very anxious to examine your hives, and induced me to visit your apiary in the village of West Philadelphia last August. In the absence of the keeper, as I informed you, I took the liberty to explore the premises thoroughly, opening and inspecting a number of the hives, and noticing the internal arrangement of the parts. The result was that I came away convinced that though your system was based on the same principles as Zerzon's, yet that your hive was almost totally different from his in construction and arrangement. That while the same objects substantially are attained by each, your hive is more simple, more convenient, and much better adapted for general introduction and use, since the mode of using it can be more easily taught. Of its ultimate and triumphant success I have no doubt. I sincerely believe that when it comes under the notice of Mr. Zerzon, he will himself prefer it to his own. It in fact combines all the good properties which a hive ought to possess, while it is free from the complication, clumsiness, vain whims, and decidedly objectionable features which characterize most of the inventions which profess to be at all superior to the simple box or the common chamber hive. You may certainly claim equal credit with Zerzon for originality in observation and discovery in the natural history of the honeybee, and for success in deducing principles and devising a most valuable system of management from observed facts. But in invention, as far as neatness, compactness, and adaptation of means to ends are concerned, the sturdy German must yield the palm to you. You will find a case of similar coincidence detailed in the Westminster Review for October 1852, page 267. I send you herewith some interesting statements respecting Zerzon and the estimate in which his system is held in Germany. Very truly yours, Samuel Wagner. The following are the statements to which Mr. Wagner refers. Quote, as the best test of the value of Mr. Zerzon's system, is the results which have been made to flow from it. A brief account of its rise and progress may be found interesting. In 1835, he commenced beekeeping in the common way with 12 colonies, and after various mishaps, which taught him the defects of the common hives and the old mode of management, his stock was so reduced that in 1838 he had virtually to begin anew. At this period, he contrived his improved hive in its ruder form, which gave him the command over all the combs, and he began to experiment on the theory which observation and study had enabled him to devise. Thenceforward his progress was as rapid as his success was complete and triumphant. Though he met with frequent reverses, about 70 colonies having been stolen from him, 60 destroyed by fire, and 24 by a flood, yet in 1846 his stock had increased to 360 colonies, and he realized from them that year 6,000 pounds of honey, besides several hundredweight of wax. At the same time, most of the cultivators in his vicinity who pursued the common methods had fewer hives than they had when he commenced. In the year 1848, a fatal pestilence known by the name of foul brood prevailed among his bees and destroyed nearly all his colonies before it could be subdued, only about 10 having escaped the malady, which attacked alike the old stocks and his artificial swarms. He estimates his entire loss that year at over 500 colonies. Nevertheless, he succeeded so well in multiplying by artificial swarms the few that remained healthy, that in the fall of 1851 his stock consisted of nearly 400 colonies. He must therefore have multiplied his stocks more than threefold each year. End quote. The highly prosperous condition of his colonies is attested by the report of the secretary of the annual Apiarian Convention, which met in his vicinity last spring. This convention, the fourth which has been held, consisted of 112 experienced and enthusiastic beekeepers from various districts of Germany and neighboring countries, and among them were some who, when they had assembled, were strong opposers of his system. They visited and personally examined the apiaries of Mr. Zertzon. The report speaks in the very highest terms of his success and of the manifest superiority of his system of management. He exhibited and satisfactorily explained to his visitors his practice and principles, and they remarked with astonishment the singular docility of his bees, and the thorough control to which they were subjected. After a full detail of the proceedings, the secretary goes on to say, quote, "Now that I have seen Mr. Zertzon's method practically demonstrated, I must admit that it is attended with fewer difficulties than I had supposed. With his hive and system of management, it would seem that bees become at once more docile than they are in other cases. I consider his system the simplest and best means of elevating bee culture to a profitable pursuit, and of spreading it far and wide over the land, especially as it is peculiarly adapted to districts in which the bees do not readily and regularly swarm. His eminent success in re-establishing his stock after suffering so heavily from the devastating pestilence, in short, the recuperative power of the system, demonstrates conclusively that it furnishes the best, perhaps the only, means of reinstating bee culture to a profitable branch of rural economy. Tsertson modestly disclaimed the idea of having attained perfection in his hive. He dwelt rather upon the truth and importance of his theory and system of management. End quote. From the Leipzig Illustrated Almanac Report on Agriculture for 1846, quote, "Bee culture is no longer regarded as of any importance in rural economy." End quote. From the same for 1851 and 1853, quote, "Since Tsertson's system has been made known, an entire revolution in bee culture has been produced. A new era has been created for it, and beekeepers are turning their attention to it with renewed zeal. The merits of his discoveries are appreciated by the government, and they recommend his system as worthy the attention of the teachers of common schools. Mr. Tsertson resides in a poor, sandy district of Middle Silesia, which, according to the common notions of apiarians, is unfavorable to bee culture. Yet despite of this and of various mishaps, he has succeeded in realizing $900 as the product of his bees in one season. By his mode of management, his bees yield, even in the poorest years, from 10 to 15% on the capital invested, and where the colonies are produced by the apiarian's own skill and labor, they cost him only about 1/4 the price at which they are usually valued. In ordinary seasons, the profit amounts to from 30 to 50%, and in very favorable seasons, from 80 to 100%. End quote. In communicating these facts to the public, I have several objects in view. I freely acknowledge that I take an honest pride in establishing my claims as an independent observer, and as having matured by my own discoveries the same system of bee culture as that which has excited so much interest in Germany. I desire also to have the testimony of the translator of Tsertson to the superior merits of my hive. Mr. Wagner is extensively known as an able German scholar. He has taken all the numbers of the Bee Journal, a monthly periodical which has been published for more than 15 years in Germany, and is probably more familiar with the state of apiarian culture abroad than any man in this country. I am anxious further to show that the great importance which I attach to my system of management is amply justified by the success of those who, while pursuing the same system with inferior hives, have attained results which to common beekeepers seem almost incredible. Inventors are very prone to form exaggerated estimates of the values of their labors, and the American public has been so often deluded with patent hives devised by persons ignorant of the most important principles in the natural history of the bee, and which have utterly failed to answer their professed objects, that they are scarcely to be blamed for rejecting every new hive as unworthy of confidence. There is now a prospect that a bee journal will before long be established in this country. Such a publication has long been needed. Properly conducted, it will have a most powerful influence in disseminating information, awakening enthusiasm, and guarding the public against the miserable impositions to which it has so long been subjected. 2 such journals are now published monthly in Germany, one of which has been in existence for more than 15 years, and their wide circulation has made thousands well acquainted with those principles, which must constitute the foundation of any enlightened and profitable system of culture. The truth is that while many of the principal facts in the physiology of the honeybee have long been familiar to scientific observers, it has unfortunately happened that some of the most important have been widely discredited. In themselves, they are so wonderful, and to those who have not witnessed them, often so incredible, that it is not at all strange that they have been rejected as fanciful conceits or barefaced inventions. Many persons have not the slightest idea that everything may be seen that takes place in a beehive, but hives have for many years been in use, containing only one large comb enclosed on both sides by glass. These hives are darkened by shutters, and when opened, the queen is exposed to observation, as well as all the other bees. Within the last 2 years, I have discovered that with proper precautions, colonies can be made to work in observing hives without shutters, and exposed continually to the full light of day, so that observations may be made at all times, without in the least interrupting the ordinary operation of the bees. By the aid of such hives, some of the most intelligent citizens of Philadelphia have seen in my apiary the queen bee depositing her eggs in the cells, and constantly surrounded by an affectionate circle of her devoted children. They have also witnessed with astonishment and delight all the steps in the mysterious process of raising queens from eggs, which with the ordinary development would have produced only the common bees. For more than 3 months, there was not a day in which some of my colonies were not engaged in making new queens to supply the place of those taken from them, and I had the pleasure of exhibiting all the facts to beekeepers who never before felt willing to credit them. As all my hives are so made that each comb can be taken out and examined at pleasure, those who use them can obtain from them all the information which they need, and are no longer forced to take anything upon trust. May I be permitted to express the hope that the time is now at hand when the number of practical observers will be so multiplied that ignorant and designing men will neither be able to impose their conceits and falsehoods upon the public, nor be sustained in their attempts to depreciate the valuable discoveries of those who have devoted years of observation and experiment to promote the advancement of apiarian knowledge. Chapter 2. The honeybee capable of being tamed or domesticated to a most surprising degree. If the bee had not such a necessary and yet formidable weapon, both of offense and defense, multitudes would be induced to enter upon its cultivation, who are now afraid to have anything to do with it. as the new system of management which I have devised seems to add to this inherent difficulty by taking the greatest possible liberties with so irascible an insect, I deem it important to show clearly in the very outset how bees may be managed, so that all necessary operations may be performed in an apiary without incurring any serious risk of exciting their anger. Many persons have been unable to control their expressions of wonder and astonishment on seeing me open hive after hive in my experimental apiary in the vicinity of Philadelphia, removing the combs covered with bees and shaking them off in front of the hives, exhibiting the queen, transferring the bees to another hive, and in short, dealing with them as if they were as harmless as so many flies. I have sometimes been asked if the bees with which I was experimenting had not been subjected to a long course of instruction to prepare them for public exhibition, when in some cases the very hives which I was opening contained swarms which had been brought only the day before to my establishment. Before entering upon the natural history of the bee, I shall anticipate some principles in its management in order to prepare my readers to receive, without the doubts which would otherwise be very natural, the statements in my book, and to convince them that almost anyone favorably situated may safely enjoy the pleasure and profit of a pursuit which has been most appropriately styled the poetry of rural economy, and that without being made too familiar with a sharp little weapon which can most speedily and effectually convert all the poetry into very sorry prose. The Creator intended the bee for the comfort of man, as truly as he did the horse or the cow. In the very early ages of this world, indeed until very recently, honey was almost the only natural sweet, and the promise of a land flowing with milk and honey had then a significance, the full force of which it is difficult for us to realize. The honey bee was, therefore, created not merely with the ability to store up its delicious nectar for its own use, but with certain properties which fitted it to be domesticated and to labor for man, and without which he would no more have been able to subject it to his control than to make a useful beast of burden of a lion or a tiger. One of the peculiarities which constitutes the very foundation, not merely of my system of management, but of the ability of man to domesticate at all so irascible an insect, has never, to my knowledge, been clearly stated as a great and controlling principle. It may be thus expressed. A honey bee never volunteers an attack or acts on the offensive when it is gorged or filled with honey. The man who first attempted to lodge a swarm of bees in an artificial hive was doubtless agreeably surprised at the ease with which he was able to accomplish it, for when the bees are intending to swarm, they fill their honey bags to the utmost capacity. This is wisely ordered, that they may have materials for commencing operations immediately in their new habitation, that they may not starve if several stormy days should follow their emigration, and that when they leave their hives, they may be in a suitable condition to be secured by man. They issue from their hives in the most peaceable mood that can well be imagined, and unless they are abused, allow themselves to be treated with great familiarity. The hiving of bees by those who understand their nature could almost always be conducted without the risk of any annoyance. If it were not the case that some improvident or unfortunate ones occasionally come forth without the soothing supply, and not being stored with honey, are filled with the gall of the bitterest hate against all mankind and animal kind in general, and anyone who dares to meddle with them in particular, such radicals are always to be dreaded, for they must vent their spleen on something, even though they lose their life in the act. Suppose the whole colony on sallying forth to possess such a ferocious spirit. No one would ever dare to hive them unless clad in a coat of mail, and not even then until all the windows of his house were closed, his domestic animals bestowed in some safe place, and sentinels posted at suitable stations to warn all comers to look out for something almost as much to be dreaded as a fiery locomotive in full speed. In short, if the propensity to be exceedingly good-natured after a hearty meal had not been given to the bee, it could never have been domesticated, and our honey would still be procured from the clefts of rocks or the hollows of trees. A second peculiarity in the nature of the bee, and one of which I continually avail myself with the greatest success, may be thus stated. Bees cannot, under any circumstances, resist the temptation to fill themselves with liquid sweets. It would be quite as easy for an inveterate miser to look with indifference upon a golden shower of doubloons falling at his feet and soliciting his appropriation. If then we can contrive a way to call their attention to a treat of running sweets when we wish to perform any operation which might provoke them, we may be sure they will accept it, and under its genial influence allow us without molestation to do what we please. We must always be particularly careful not to handle them roughly, for they will never allow themselves to be pinched or hurt without thrusting out their sting to resent such an indignity. I always keep a small watering pot or sprinkler in my apiary, and whenever I wish to operate upon a hive, as soon as the cover is taken off and the bees exposed, I sprinkle them gently with water sweetened with sugar. They help themselves with the greatest eagerness, and in a few moments are in a perfectly manageable state. The truth is that bees managed on this plan are always glad to see visitors, and you cannot look in upon them too often, for they expect at every call to receive a sugared treat by way of a peace offering. I can superintend a large number of hives, performing every operation that is necessary for pleasure or profit, and yet not run the risks of being stung, which must frequently be incurred in attempting to manage, in the simplest way, the common hives. Those who are timid may, at first, use a bee dress, though they will soon discard everything of the kind unless they are of the number of those to whom bees have a special aversion. Such unfortunates are sure to be stung whenever they show themselves in the vicinity of a beehive, and they will do well to give the bees a very wide berth. Apiarians have, for many years, employed the smoke of tobacco for subduing their bees. It deprives them at once of all disposition to sting, but it ought never to be used for such a purpose. If the construction of the hives will not permit the bees to be sprinkled with sugar water, the smoke of burning paper or rags will answer every purpose, and the bees will not be likely to resent it. Whereas, when they recover from the effect of the tobacco, they not unfrequently remember, and in no very gentle way, the operator who administered the nauseous dose. Let all your motions about your hives be gentle and slow. Accustom your bees to your presence. Never crush or injure them in any operation. Acquaint yourself fully with the principles of management detailed in this treatise, and you will find that you have but little more reason to dread the sting of a bee than the horns of your favorite cow or the heels of your faithful horse. And with the end of Chapter 2, I think we'll end this evening's reading from The Hive and the Honey Bee, a Beekeeper's Manual by the Reverend L.L. Langstroth. I find bees absolutely fascinating, so I'm looking forward to reading more from this work. If you'd like to read it for yourself, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect or suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, the best place to catch me is on Twitter at BoringBooksPod, or drop me an email via our website, www.boringbookspod.com. I always love hearing from you. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.